Altered is a brand new, bright and colourful TCG that seeks to try something different than classics like Magic the Gathering. You and an opponent are racing to explore a new world after it was drastically changed in a magical storm known as the Confluence, where the realms of imagination fused with ours. Play cool characters, build permanent landmarks, and cast spells to make sure your hero is the winner. Whether this is your first card game or you're looking to pick up a new TCG obsession, this video will tell you everything you need to know to play your first game. And if you stick around to the end, we even have a giveaway of some lovely Altered goodies, so make sure not to miss that. There's no combat or life totals to wear down in Altered. Instead, you focus on progressing through each region by having the highest attributes. Whoever has the highest in each region type will move forward on a central track, and the player who gets their hero and companion to meet in the middle first wins the game. This is a collectible card game, of course, so first of all, let's take a look at your deck. If this is your first time playing, we'd recommend picking up one of the 6 different starter decks for your first game. Each one represents a different faction, leaning into that faction's unique playstyle. Axiom are the engineers championing technology and science. Bravos are the brave adventurers always pushing the limits. Lyra are free-spirited artists, and if you like gambling with dice like I do, you'll love them. Muna seek balance and peace with nature. Ordis are the soldiers and bureaucrats upholding order. And Izmir are mystics exploring the magic of the world. Once you have a starter deck, they're very easy to upgrade and tweak with booster packs too, so definitely a good starting point for new players or seasoned TCG fans alike. If you're looking to build your own, Altered decks have a minimum of 40 cards, one of which must be your hero. These are what you build around, acting a bit like a commander card in Magic the Gathering. The rest are made of any cards in your hero's faction, a max of 15 of which can be rares, which you can always spot by the borderless art and blue triangle at the card's top. Then up to 3 cards in your deck can be uniques. These don't count towards your rare limit. Altered is interesting in that the rare cards you collect are upgrades of already existing ones, which can make building much easier, with a lot of obvious direct switches to more powerful versions of cards you're already playing. Unique cards, on the other hand, are one-of-a-kind upgrades. They will be the only ones to exist in the entire world, truly unique, which is very fun and cool when you pull them. Each deck is limited to only using cards from your faction. However, some rare ones are color swap versions of cards usually only available to other factions. These give you a taste of what the other factions are up to, and sometimes their rules text will change to match the flavor and playstyles of the factions they've been swapped into. You can only have up to 3 copies of each card in your deck, so even though I would like an army of them, I only get 3 Sneezer Shrooms in my deck. When counting how many of each card you have, you should only care about their card name. A rare Sneezer Shroom and a common Sneezer Shroom still count as 2 of the same card, even if they have different stats. Before we get into playing, let's have a closer look at the cards you'll have in your deck. The first card you'll need is your hero card. As mentioned, they're what you build your deck around. They start the game on the mat and stick around for the whole play session. At the top, they have their faction and then a unique ability underneath the art. Each hero card has a different ability, and they should make sense once you understand how to play the game. Then, the most common type of card you'll encounter is a character card. These are how you boost your attributes in expeditions and progress through the tumult to win the game. Let's take a look at this Daughter of Yggdrasil card. At the top, we have the name of the card, its faction, represented by a banner, and then the type and subtype of the card. In this case, character, plant. Certain cards might reference subtypes, such as Yongsu, who gains a boost when he enters play if you control 2 or more plants. Whilst we're chatting about Yongsu, it's important to note that cards you control only count cards that are currently in play. That's anything in either of your expeditions or your landmark zone. Cards in your reserve, as well as any in your hand or discard pile, do not count as cards you control. Then these two numbers at the top of the card are the cost to play it. The first is how much mana you need to play it from your hand, and the second is how much it costs from reserve. Cards in your hand are obviously these, the ones you hold, but the reserve is a separate section of your board where characters move to at night, but we can cover that in more detail later in the video. Alongside the lovely art on the card are the 3 region attributes: forest represented by the leaf, mountain by the mountain, and water by the raindrop. These are the numbers you add up at the end of a round to determine who wins the region and moves forward. You need to have the highest attribute in the region you're playing in to progress. So this one has 5 in forest and mountain, but only 3 in water, so is weaker when played in a water region. But don't worry, other cards can boost her and add to her final attribute score. Then we have the card's ability. This is a separate effect to the game. They each have different symbols next to them that tell you when they trigger. The arrow means it triggers whenever the card is played. The hand means it triggers only when you cast it from your hand. And the card with lines next to it here means it only happens when you play the card from reserve. Some cards have abilities that trigger at certain times of day too. If something says at noon or at dusk, for example, you trigger that ability as soon as the next phase starts. So this rare Sneezer Shroom I have gains an extra boost at noon. So as soon as noon comes around, I put a counter on it to show the new boost and then move on to the next phase. Some cards also have a secondary ability at the bottom that has a card with an X in it. This means you can discard them from your reserve instead of playing them to trigger that new ability. This is called a quick action, which we'll discuss more in the phases of play. There is also the QR code. This is how you scan and track the cards you own. We'll do a section on that at the end, but it's actually a very cool system. There are 2 other types of cards to be aware of too. Permanent landmarks. These sit on the side of your playmat and stick around for the entire game until you send them to the discard. You can only have 2 at once, but will be likely to have a few in your deck. So sometimes you have to choose which ones to keep and which ones to discard. They can be expensive to play, but they often have important or powerful abilities that keep triggering and help you win. And finally, there are spell cards. These are played, trigger their ability, and then head straight to your reserve. If you then later play them from your reserve, they have to go straight to your discard, a bit like a character with fleeting. So once you have a deck and are starting to understand the cards, let's get into setting up for a game. In your starter deck, you'll have received these Tumult cards. These show the regions your characters will be adventuring across to win. Shuffle them together and then place them face down in the middle of the table between the 2 players. When shuffling, make sure to change the orientation of the cards as well, as they can be placed on the table in either direction. Then take the hero and companion region cards and place them at either end of the Tumult. These are your starting places. Then you'll also have a set of counters to use. Pick the hero and companion that match your faction's colours and place them on the corresponding cards for each player. Then below this, in your play space, place your hero in the middle so you can clearly divide each expedition. Next, randomly decide who goes first and place the first player marker on their hero. We often flip the marker to decide. Unlike most games, going first is usually the worst choice in Altered, as it uses a lot of gambling on what your opponent might do next, which you can't find out until they play. However, sometimes it can be useful, so it's not all bad. Now you can shuffle your deck and place it at the bottom of your play space, making sure to take out any character tokens and reference cards if you're using a starter deck. Make sure to leave room for a discard pile next to it too. It's recommended to keep your deck on the right hand side so your discard doesn't mix with your mana pool. Each player then draws 6 cards from the top and chooses 3 of them to place face down in their mana pool. This will be your starting mana to play with. Altered doesn't allow mulligans where you return your cards and redraw, but on each morning you're drawing 2 cards, which usually balances a handout. Then, once you've done that, you get to play! A game of Altered is split into 5 phases: morning, noon, afternoon, dusk, and night. The morning phase is basically your upkeep if you're used to other card games. This step is skipped for the first turn in a new game though, so you go straight to the noon phase if this is your very first turn. Otherwise, you start your morning by changing the first player counter from one player to another. You ready up any exhausted cards like your hero or your mana orbs, then you draw 2 new cards from your deck, and starting with the first player, choose if you want to place a card from your hand into the mana pool. We'd recommend always doing this for the first few turns to build up a good mana base, but later down the line you might feel like you have enough to play with. Then, once everyone has done this, you move to noon. This is basically an extra phase where abilities trigger. Any cards that have an at noon effect can be activated here, such as adding a boost on my rare little cutie Sneezer Shroom here. Then we move to the afternoon phase, and this is where the action happens. Starting with the first player, you take turns playing 1 card at a time. To play a card, using the mana in your pool, exhaust the amount indicated at the top by turning them 90 degrees so it sits horizontal. This shows the mana has been spent and can't be used again until the next morning. Then you can place your character in either the hero or companion side of the expedition zone. Characters only count their stats on the side they're played, so either the right or left, unless a keyword states otherwise, but we'll get into those later. Once you've decided, place your character down. You'll likely start off playing cards from your hand, but you can also play cards from reserve. As mentioned before, these use the secondary mana cost listed on the card, and when they enter, you put a fleeting counter on them. This means that when they leave the expedition at night, they go to the discard instead of back to your reserve. On your turn, as well as playing cards, you can perform quick actions. You can do as many of these as you like on a turn before you pass to the next player. There are 2 different types. Exhaust abilities are represented by this symbol and are often found on hero and landmark cards. You simply exhaust the card and then perform the ability listed. For example, Izmir Hero Akasha can be exhausted to pass the turn to another player without having to play any cards. Once you've exhausted her though, much like mana, she won't ready up again until the next morning. So use your abilities wisely. Then there are support abilities as quick actions represented by this symbol. These are only usable if the card is already in your reserve. To use it, discard your card rather than playing it from reserve, sending it straight to your discard, and perform the action listed. If I discarded the Studious Disciple, for example, the next spell I play this turn will have its cost reduced by 1. Support abilities don't cost any mana to activate, but now I've used that ability, my Studious Disciple will be sent from my reserve to my discard. Once you've done as many quick actions as you like and played your card for turn, you hand over to the next player. They then do the same and hand play back to you. This goes back and forth until you decide to pass the turn instead of playing something. This means you can't do anything else until dusk. The other player can then keep playing cards until they're happy and also pass, at which point you then both move forward to the next phase, dusk. Altered is a little different to standard card games in that you can only play 1 card at a time before your opponent is then able to do the same. This back and forth play will force you to play certain spells and characters without perfect information, and learning how to sequence your card plays well and not overcommit before your opponent has revealed their hand is one of the key ways to becoming a pro Altered TCG player. At dusk, you determine who wins each region in both expeditions and therefore who moves forward, exploring the tumult. Starting with one side, add up the collective attributes of all your characters for the corresponding regions. The first card on either side of the tumult represents all regions, but as you move forward, you'll only be counting the symbols on the region that your hero or companion counter is on. For example, here my hero can only progress with the character's water attributes. You compare scores of all your present characters added up, and whoever has the highest in that attribute moves forward, provided the region you're in matches. You do this for both expeditions independently. Sometimes my hero and my opponent's hero can be on different spaces in the tumult and therefore trying to win different regions. We still compare attributes in the same way though, but while I might be trying to win mountain to move forward, they might be trying to win water. If you both win in one of your respective attributes, you both move forward. However, if one of your attributes draws with an opponent's, neither of you will be able to use it to move forward. Sometimes it's useful to have high attributes in a region type you can't progress in, as while it won't gain you any ground, it could still block your opponent from moving. Expeditions can only move forward once per dusk, so even if your hero won both mountain and forest and both regions counted, you'll only move your hero counter one space forward. Once you've both worked out who won and who moved the correct hero and companion counters forward, you finish dusk and you move into night. This is the final stage of a round. Here, any characters in play are sent to your reserve. However, if they're fleeting, they go straight to your discard pile instead. Then cleanup happens. If you have any extra landmarks or cards in your reserve, you now need to discard any extras until you're down to just 2 in each. Then you start a new round. Morning begins again and you repeat the whole process until someone wins the game. To win, you need to be the first person to have your hero and companion counters touch as they meet in the tumult. If both you and an opponent achieve this at the same time though, you see if one player moved further forward than needed, and if so, they will win. Otherwise, if it's an equal achievement, you play one more tiebreaker round in the arena. The arena is on the back of the companion card. You place it in the middle of the table and play out a normal day going through all the same phases. Then, at dusk, combine the score of all your attributes on both sides rather than left and right. The winner is the person who scores the highest in the most regions. So if we tie in water, but I win in forest and mountain, I would win the game. If you still reach a tie here, restart another day and try again in the arena. Also a note, any abilities that trigger a hero or companion moving forward on an expedition don't count in the arena. That is basically the basic rundown of how to play Altered. Before we head off though, let's run through all of the keywords you'll come across from fleeting to anchored so you can make sure you know exactly what your cards mean. In almost all card games, keywords allow the designers to tell you that a card has a common ability that a lot of cards share, without having to type out the exact ruling of that ability in every rules box. Let's take a look at some of the most common keywords you'll come across in Altered. As we learned earlier, a card with fleeting will go straight to the discard pile when it leaves play, rather than heading to the reserve. You'll most often see fleeting given to characters played from the reserve, but some cards have fleeting printed into their rules text, most commonly spells. If you play a spell with fleeting, it'll go straight to discard after it resolves. If a character with fleeting enters an expedition, it'll go to the discard after it leaves, even if you played it from your hand. Whilst token isn't itself a keyword, many of the cards and heroes in Altered create them. A token is a temporary card created by another card's effect that can only exist in the expedition. At the moment, there are only token characters, but that could potentially change in the future. Tokens aren't proper cards and they can't be added to your deck, held in your hand, or anything else for that matter. They're created in an expedition and then they stay there until they leave that expedition, at which point they'll be removed from the game immediately, even if an effect would tell you to put them in your discard pile or your reserve. Whenever a card tells you to resupply, you'll take the top card of your deck and put it into your reserve. If your resupply flips a card that has an effect when played from reserve, you'll be able to utilize that effect right away. If a card ever tells you to roll one or more dice, those dice will always be a d6 unless stated otherwise. Record the result of your roll and then refer to the rest of the rules text to see what effect you'll get in return. Some cards will allow you to manipulate the results of your dice roll, in which case you resolve those abilities before checking what effect your dice roll gives you. Some cards will allow you to force your opponent to discard a card. If the card states that your opponent discards a card from their hand, they'll pick one of the cards in their hand and discard it. However, sometimes cards will allow you to discard a target character or permanent in play. Whenever a card is discarded, it goes straight to the discard pile, even if it wasn't fleeting. This is the best way to get rid of something you don't want your opponent to have. Discard effects, like we just mentioned, can only target things in your opponent's hand or things that are currently in play. To get rid of something from your opponent's reserve, you'll have to use Sabotage instead. When you play a card with Sabotage, remove a card from your opponent's reserve. It goes straight to their discard pile. An After You effect allows you to pass the turn over to your opponent without playing a card. However, unlike a normal turn pass, you'll still be able to play cards when the turn is passed back to you. After you effects are a great way to force your opponent into revealing their hand early so that you can play your cards with better knowledge on the board. Some cards force your opponent to sacrifice or carry an additional cost to play them in the form of a sacrifice. When a card instructs you to sacrifice a card, you'll have to discard one of your own cards of that type from play, typically a character. That character will go straight to your discard pile. You only sacrifice a character or permanent if you have one of the matching type in play. If an opponent tries to force you to sacrifice a character, but you don't have any in play, then you won't have to do anything. However, be careful when playing characters that force you to sacrifice a character when they enter play, like the Kraken. As if you don't have another character to sacrifice, they'll end up sacrificing themselves to their own effect. Whenever you're told to boost a character, you'll place a +1/+1/+1 counter onto it. This is a boost counter and it increases all of that character's attributes by 1. A character can have multiple boost counters on it and they'll all individually increase its attributes by 1. As long as a character has a boost counter on it, it counts as boosted. This will matter for some cards' abilities, like this Lyra Thespian card. Normally, when a character leaves an expedition, they'll also lose any boost counters they had on them as well. A seasoned character gets to keep any boost counters they're holding when they leave the expedition at night to go to the reserve. When you play that character from the reserve on a following afternoon, they'll enter with the boost counters they kept last time around. If a seasoned character leaves an expedition zone to any other than the reserve, like the discard pile or your hand, then it will lose its boost counters as normal. If it ever goes to the reserve though, it'll keep them, even if it was forced there by an opponent's effect. When a character becomes anchored, you place an anchored counter on it. At night, when characters normally go to the reserve, you instead remove the anchored counter from that character and they remain already in place for the next day. They won't leave the expedition, so any counters they had on them, like boosts for example, will remain in place. If a character ever becomes asleep, then much like anchored, you remove their sleep counter at night and they'll remain on the expedition for the next afternoon. However, a character with an asleep counter on them will not provide their attributes to the current expedition, because they're taking a nap. Eternal characters never leave expeditions at nighttime. They'll stay on the board for the rest of the game unless an opponent can remove them. Eternal characters are very powerful, but usually pretty expensive. A character with a defender keyword will block their own expedition from moving forward at the end of a day. Defenders usually have high attributes for low cost, but effectively can only be played to stop your opponents moving forward, and won't make any progress for you on your own expeditions. Defenders only block movement for their own expedition, meaning they won't affect the other side of your board. And if your opponent can beat your attributes, they'll still be able to move forward as well. A character with the tough keyword is more expensive to target with your abilities and spells. Tough is an X keyword, which means it's always followed by a number. If a character has tough 3, then opponents attempting to target it with a spell or ability must pay an additional 3 mana. If opponents can't afford to pay the extra mana, then they cannot target it. Gigantic characters count their attributes in both expeditions at once. Whilst they're placed in one expedition, you can imagine them being so big that they actually sit in both. Their attributes are added to each expedition independently as well, so you don't have to share the stats between them. For the sake of counting up your scores at the end of a day, you can just pretend that there's an exact copy of that card in the other expedition. Whilst these are all the keywords you'll come across from Altered's first set, there's sure to be more added in later sets to come. But you can find all the details of a card and what it does on Altered's website or app. Just scan the QR code on the card for more details. Speaking of, you might have noticed that all Altered cards have a QR code on them. This is because Altered uses an app to keep track of what cards you own. When you open a pack, make sure to scan your cards to add them to your collection. Not only does it make keeping track of what you have and deck building easier, it opens up the digital marketplace. Any card you own can be sold to other people just by using the online service, because Altered actually lets you print copies of cards you digitally own. You can print as many as you want and even get foil versions using the foiler cards you get in packs. This means you could print off whole sets to use sitting down to play with your friends. However, if you want to enter any tournaments, you need to prove you own your cards using the digital app. The QR codes scan in very easily, so it doesn't feel like a hassle, don't worry. It's honestly one of the things that actually impressed me most when I first played. Even if you don't think you care about owning your cards digitally, I would recommend it, especially for rare cards or uniques, as I actually had someone steal one of mine by screen grabbing my Instagram story, so it just pays to keep them safe. The QR codes are also very helpful for play, as each card's code leads to a page with all of the details on that card and its rules text. It has lore on the characters featured on your card. It has clarifications of common rules questions for that card, and if you're playing against a player whose cards are printed in another language, you can even scan the QR code to get the rules text in your native language. When you scan a QR code, you'll also be able to see all of the different variations of a card, including its rare and color-shifted versions. Very helpful for deck building. The QR codes work in any smartphone camera app, so you don't even have to have the Altered app installed, as it will lead you to a web page for whatever card you scan. And that is it! That's how you play the brand new TCG Altered. It might feel a little different than what you're used to if you play trading card games, but we found it really easy to get into and a lot of fun. It really does something different in a very satisfying way. If you want to see an actual game of Altered to get even more of a taste of how it all works, we actually have a Let's Play on the channel you can check out right now. If you found this video helpful, give it a like. For more on Altered, make sure to subscribe. This definitely won't be the last thing we have to say on one of our new favourite card games. And now the part you've been waiting for. The lovely folks at Equinox Games have given us some Altered bits to give away to our audience. We're running 2 separate giveaways, one right here on YouTube and another over on our Patreon. So you can be in with a chance to win both. To enter on YouTube, leave us a comment with your favourite faction and subscribe to the channel. You'll automatically be entered in with a chance to win 2 Altered TCG Beyond the Gates booster packs and a pack of Gamegenic art sleeves with the faction of your choice. To win on Patreon, you'll just have to subscribe to any of our supporter tiers for as little as £1 a month. The winner there will receive 2 Altered Beyond the Gates booster packs and an official Gamegenic Altered playmat. You can enter into both giveaways and double your chances to win your prize. Who knows, you might even be lucky enough to win both. There's only 1 entry per platform per person. You can only enter if you're in a North American or European territory. You must be over 18 to enter the competition, and if you aren't, you'll have to ask a parent or guardian to enter on your behalf. Thanks so much for watching! We'll see you on the next video. If you're confused about anything we've mentioned in this video, feel free to comment below and we'll try to clarify for you. Have fun playing and good luck exploring the tumult!